You know, we tend to think of threats to our freedom as coming from the top down, a king, a government. But what if the greatest threat to your liberty isn't a dictator, but your neighbors, your colleagues, the very society you live in? Today, we're diving into a powerful idea from the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill that feels like it was written for this exact moment. Mill just dives right into his famous essay on liberty with this pretty chilling warning. And listen to what he's saying here. He's not talking about laws or police. He's describing a pressure to conform that's so powerful, so pervasive that it can literally enslave the soul itself. That's the core idea we're going to unpack. Okay, section 1, liberty versus the crown. Now, to really get why Mill's idea was such a big deal, we have to rewind a bit and see what the fight for liberty looked like before he came along. For most of history, right, the battle for liberty was pretty straightforward. It was the people on one side and a powerful ruler on the other. A king, an emperor, a despot. Liberty was all about building walls, both legal and political, to protect yourself from their power. And how'd they do that? Well, they had a couple of main tools in their toolbox. First, they fought for specific rights and liberties, lines the ruler just couldn't cross. And second, they set up constitutional checks. Think of things like a parliament, which meant the ruler couldn't just do whatever they wanted. They needed the community's okay for the big stuff. All right, section 2, a new kind of tyranny. So, as democracy starts to take hold, that old enemy, the absolute ruler, begins to fade away. But Mill saw something new and dangerous emerging. The threat to liberty hadn't vanished. It had just changed its clothes. And this is the absolute heart of it. When we say the people rule, what that really means is the majority rules. And Mill had this huge insight that majority can be just as oppressive as any king. The threat wasn't coming from up on a throne anymore. It was coming from the crowd you're standing in. So Mill really breaks down the difference between these two. You've got political tyranny on one hand. That's the obvious stuff. It's the government, it's laws, it's penalties. But then there's social tyranny. And this stuff is way more subtle. It's the pressure of what's popular, the unspoken rules of how you should think and act. And as Mill warns, it's harder to escape because it gets into every little detail of your life. So, if both the government and society can be tyrants, where do you draw the line? Well, Mill came up with an answer he called one very simple principle. We know it today as the harm principle. And here it is, the only reason anyone, the government, your community, whoever, can interfere with your freedom against your will is to stop you from harming someone else. That's it. Not because they don't like what you're doing, not because they think it's strange, and not even for your own good. Only to prevent harm to others. This quote really gets to the foundation of the harm principle. I mean, think about that. In the sphere of your own life, your own thoughts, and your own body, the individual is the absolute ruler. You are sovereign. This was a really radical defense of personal freedom. For Mill, this sovereignty was most important when it came to ideas. He argued that silencing any opinion is a terrible mistake for 3 huge reasons. First, hey, that idea you're trying to shut down might actually be true, and you'd be robbing everyone of the truth. Second, even if it's wrong, debating it forces us to understand why our own beliefs are right, which stops them from becoming what he called dead dogma. And third, very often, the full truth is a mix of 2 competing views. Yeah, let's zoom in on that phrase, dead dogma. It's such a great concept. It's a belief that, sure, it might be true, but because nobody ever argues about it anymore, people just repeat it like parrots. They don't know why it's true. It loses all its meaning and power. For an idea to stay alive, Mill says, it has to fight for its life. Okay, section 4, the new majority. So, how does a warning from the 1800s apply to us right now? This is where it gets really interesting. What if today's tyranny of the majority isn't a mob in the street, but an expert-led consensus that we're told is simply not up for debate? And you can see this tension all over the place, right? Look at some of these debates, particularly in the UK. Things like ULEZ, the whole 15-minute city idea, new digital currencies, green mandates. These are often rolled out as the expert solution. And that immediately raises a million questions. Is there still room for fearless discussion? Or is just asking questions now considered a problem? Let's use the ULEZ debate as a perfect case study. The expert claim is pretty straightforward. It's based on models that say it prevents thousands of deaths. But Mill would immediately ask, okay, but what's the partial truth being silenced here? And in this case, it's the very real trade-off in liberty and the financial burden placed on people who need their older vehicles. So from this viewpoint, the tyranny isn't the policy itself, but the pressure to accept a simple binary, clean air versus toxic air, without being allowed to question the data. That's how you get a modern dead dogma.
And you see a similar playbook with the 15-minute city idea. On the surface, it's framed as simple convenience. But the moment people ask questions about freedom of movement or tracking, what happens? Well, those concerns are often dismissed with a label, like conspiracy theory. This is a modern form of social tyranny. It doesn't use laws, it uses stigma to shut the conversation down.
This all leads us to Section 5, Liberty's Unanswered Question. And this really puts Mill's entire philosophy to the test in our modern world.
And it boils down to this really tough question for our time. If we are told that we are in a permanent state of emergency, a climate crisis, a health crisis, what happens to the harm principle? Does the definition of harm expand forever? Does preventing harm to others become a blank check for overriding individual freedom in almost every part of life?
So here's the bottom line. John Stuart Mill gave us a framework for protecting liberty, not just from kings, but from the crowd. He championed dissent and argument as the only path to a living truth. The question for us today is whether that framework can even survive in an age that demands consensus and urgent action. Where do you think we should draw the line?